Welcome everyone to the next in our Pakistan 100 series. This event is sort of different from our usual ones. We have a conversation with Ms. Nasim Zehra on her brilliant new book. Typically these are more of sort of panels in terms of format, but we thought this is sort of one of the key pieces of literature that has come out on the country in the last few years. So it sort of deserves to have a platform of its own. The Pakistan 100 series is our attempt to get more sort of debate about Pakistan's policy future that sort of emanates from academic discourse out to a general public. We've had sort of panels from everything on Pakistan's foreign policy to water and so on. And we're going to continue hopefully for another few months. We touch upon things such as education, such as sports, hopefully, health, all sorts of other things. My guest tonight today are Ms. Nasim Zehra, who needs no introduction, but I'll furnish you with one nonetheless. Ms. Zehra is, of course, a prominent journalist in the country, one of the foremost. She holds an MBA from Quaid-e-Azam University and a master's degree in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. She has been a fellow of the Harvard University Asia Center and has been a visiting faculty member of Quaid-e-Azam University, NUST, and the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. She's also been on the President's Advisory Committee on Foreign Affairs and National Security, a member of the Kashmir Committee and Pakistan Special Envoy on UNSC reforms for Canada and Latin America. Our moderator today is Syed Hassan Akbar. Hassan is Director of Programs at the Jinnah Institute, where he manages the strategic security and open democracy initiatives, including the longest-running India-Pakistan Track 2 initiative. He's a graduate in international affairs from Columbia and has been a Fulbright scholar. He's also a Lumenite, so welcome him back. The discussion today is about Kargil, and of course this is one of the sort of biggest mistakes in some sense that the country has made, and one that sort of happened at a time of flux. So we were just looking at the numbers earlier, and if you look at the ratio between Pakistan's military spending and India's in the 5 years before Kargil, there was a 1-to-3 ratio in that spending. Of course, this is at a time when India was undergoing economic reform, and so in the present day, the previous 5-year defense spending imbalance between India and Pakistan is now nearly twice at 5.89 times more spending for India. And so it really sort of strikes that Kargil was an opportunity, or more precisely the Lahore Declaration just before Kargil was an opportunity to get our foreign affairs in better shape that we missed out on. Because Pakistan 100 is intended to think about the future, the focus today is going to be more about what we can learn in terms of our foreign affairs going forward. And I'd like to ask Hassan to take over proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. First, I'd like to thank Ali and his team at Pakistan at 100 for inviting me. It's a privilege to be in discussion with Nasim Zehra, who I'm a big fan of, and to talk about her book, From Kargil to the Coup. It's also good to be back at LUMS after slightly more than a decade. So, seeing the changes at LUMS is good. So before we start today, I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the discussion today. I'll be in conversation with Nasim for approximately 50 minutes to an hour, and then we'll open up for a question-answer session, which I hope will be interactive so that you can ask questions that come to your mind through the day. When you talk about From Kargil to the Coup, I'd like to congratulate Nasim on what is perhaps, in my view, one of the most important works of scholarship on foreign policy and in Pakistan's modern history. Not only because this book accurately captures the events that led up to Kargil and what happened after Kargil, both in the military sense as well as the diplomatic maneuvers that took place. And it's also important because the book comes out, and let's not forget that in 2001, after the war on terrorism, Kargil took a back step in the imagination of many in Pakistan. Most analysts in Pakistan, most writers abroad that looked at Pakistan started talking about the war on terrorism. And so Kargil really left our imaginations. And I think this book has played a critical role in bringing Kargil and that misadventure, if I may call it that, back into focus and looking at whether we can learn some lessons, whether we can understand how foreign policy decision and military decision making took place during that event. Has that evolved today? And is there was there learning institutionally as well in Pakistan? So all these questions I think are very significant. And so without further ado, my first question to Ms. Nasim would be, why Kargil? And why Kargil from the coup? How did this idea come in your mind? And how long did it take you to conceptualize the idea? Again, most scholarship in Pakistan after 2001 focused on the Taliban, terrorism, the Haqqani network, Afghanistan, etc. So in that period, why did you continue to focus on something which was very important for us, but perhaps had gone at the back of our minds?
Thank you, Hassan, and if I may thank Lams and Hasnan, you particularly, Professor Ali Hasnan, for putting this together. And before I respond, I also want to say, if I may, with your permission, that when I heard Hassan say that Nasim and I will be in conversation for 50 minutes to an hour, I said, what if everybody starts getting bored? So please interrupt. Please raise your hands if you have to ask anything in between. So why Kargil? I started writing this really as a book on Pakistan-India relations. And because right after the nuclear test up until 2002, I think this relationship in about 3-4 years underwent extremes, from the nuclear test to the Lahore summit, and then Kargil, and then the 2002 near clash. So I just thought that it's fascinating what this story tells us. So as I started to work on it, I realized that on Kargil there was a lot of material I had. Now when Kargil was actually taking place, I was then writing, and hence had access to the key policymakers at that point. And it was actually an event that was spread over May 16th to July, so about 40-50 days. But those 50 days were one of the most incredible days in Pakistan's history in terms of what was uncovered, what was first told, what subsequently, the truth that came out subsequently. So I just was in some ways quite possessed by, this whole Kargil episode. And having worked on foreign policy and national security for a long time as a journalist, 1992 onwards, and this is my area of work also in foreign policy and national security, it always seemed to me that there were major issues and major problems with Pakistan's decision making. There were issues of civil-military distrust, there were issues of incompetence, there were issues of linear thinking, there were issues of not really comprehending fully the context in which Pakistan was functioning. And because of all these reasons, there was the tragic fact that Pakistan's potential was just could never get actualized. I mean, we would go halfway and then, one step forward, 2 steps backwards. And as a journalist, as a writer, working on these issues, from the sidelines, I saw this happening time and again. We can go into details subsequently. But when Kargil happened, and then as I told you, I was writing on Pakistan, India. When I got to the Kargil chapter, the initial outline was 90 pages. And a lot of it was then new information. I worked on this book over 13 years. And so I decided that this is the issue that I want to take up to illustrate to people in Pakistan at multiple levels, students, policymakers, specialists, etc., on how we can mess up on such a critical issue like Kashmir. I think Kashmir is a critical issue. It's a very important issue. It needs resolution. So that this book ended up for me becoming a case study illustrating how we commit blunders when we, when we get into serious decision making. And then obviously, in some ways, I think it would be correct to say that this book grew organically, from from notes to a chapter, from a chapter to meeting a few people in the Pakistan Army, and then moving beyond that, then looking at talking to people in India, then talking to people in Washington. So I thought that it was time to do something comprehensive, to do something serious. And when you talk about, Hassan, that Afghanistan was happening and there was 9/11 and so on, in some ways, when you look at the book, if you look at chapters 3 and 4, the context of it, all of this is related. None of this is a standalone, as is always the case. And hence I thought, this was the thing to do, to go into detail and also tell the story rather than give the judgment up front. And so the purpose, I set out, I am a very opinionated person, I like giving opinions, but in this case I decided, let the story be as objective, as honest, as truthful, and give all the dimensions of the story. And let the story then speak for itself. And what is the story? The story was about our country, about decision making, about different players, different institutions involved in critical decision making, and its setting in the national context, the power play within the country, and the regional context and the international context. So that was really the purpose of putting it together and really going after as much facts and information as I could. Maybe we can talk about that later.
Yeah. No, I think it's, you're quite on point that it is, when you read the book, I think Pakistan was, after a military adventure like that, we had not seen any major scholarship on Kargil. Whereas in India, there had been a Kargil Commission inquiry that took place. There was a lot written about from the Indian side on what happened in Kargil. Talking about the book, I think it's very instructive that you refer to the coterie of generals who undertook the planning and the execution of Kargil as the Kargil clique. And it's also in the beginning chapters of the book, you refer to the generals who were responsible, Commander FCNA, Chief of General Staff, etc. And you talk about General Musharraf himself, about how the stars aligned in some ways, that they all had some experience operating across the line of control. They had previously attempted. There's a famous case of General Musharraf presenting the plan to Benazir Bhutto. And all of these had also taken some action across the line of control as well. The commander FCNA was quite gung-ho about it. So how do you think the idea of Kargil came about? And why is it that the argument given about the secrecy for Kargil was that not a lot of people were involved in the process, but if you look at even decision making within the military, the logistics were not the adjutant general were not involved in the process, the ISI and the MI were not aware of what was happening at Kargil. So do you see flaws there? In the beginning of the book, you talk a lot about this.
I think that in some ways you were asking why work on Kargil. Some parts of this story are so incredible. I mean, and you said it's a misadventure. I think it's an incredible blunder. We have generals sitting on the front seat here, and I'm sure we'll get some feedback from them also. But the chapter called Reading Kargil, where I give my own analysis, and there's a whole military part of that chapter where I look at military generals and the assessments, a classical work on military theory, military history, and it's incredible that those who were planning this were, I think, primarily possessed by passion, by a sense of undoing a wrong. I mean, I think let me just say this at this point, that this book is really not about how good our policy is towards India or how bad our policy is towards India. That's another debate, and we can have that. And I mean, that too obviously comes into the fray because of, what was happening in terms of the Lahore summit. But in terms of such a military undertaking, where your assumption is that the adversary that you are attacking, that you're going and occupying LOC territory on the Indian side, Indian occupied Kashmir, you think that they won't react and that they won't respond. And I talked to officers after officers during the research, and they were saying that some of us would ask the concerned generals, what if India attacks, what if India responds in kind, and the assumption there was, the assumptions were so unreal, to put it politely, that I think somebody really needs to tell us how did they think that that the Indians will not respond. So what was happening? So most of these, the 4 generals had served in Kashmir, and there's, within the Pakistan army, and I think amongst a lot of Pakistanis, a sense of, having been wronged by India in 71, go back to see what's happening in Kashmir right now, what the Indians did in Kashmir, first in 47, then 48, and then in Operation Gibraltar, where Pakistan went, and in some ways there are great similarities between what happens it's called actually Operation Kohe Pema. It's Operation Kohe Pema, we refer to it as the Kargil operation. So there was so in some ways, again, it's very difficult to understand how, having committed that blunder, and one of the best books on the 65 war, Operation Gibraltar included, was written by General Mahmood, and he critiques the whole operation, Operation Gibraltar in 65 war, and yet he was one of those folk generals who decided to do this. I think they thought that that after the nuclear tests, the international community wouldn't accept any kind of prolonged tension between India and Pakistan. So if Pakistan had gone across and really blocked the lifeline for the Indian troops from Srinagar to Leh, the Indians would respond, they would panic, and when they'd panic, the international community would then say, okay, these are 2 nuclear states, eyeball to eyeball, and we can't afford a nuclear holocaust, and they will step in. Now, keep in mind the fact that in 1984, when the Indians came and under Operation Makhdood, they took over and occupied Siachen, completely illegally but very stealthily. When General Ziaul Haq was asked, the then military ruler, at a press conference that, what is this? Siachen, Indians have occupied Siachen, and his response was that something to the effect that not a blade of grass grows there. So I think, so the understanding and the assumption was, number one, that the Indians will only panic, they will not respond militarily, and before they respond militarily, the international community will step in. And I mean, in so many words, this was told to me even by the generals who were involved, that they will step in and basically settle something on Siachen and on Kashmir as well. But obviously that didn't happen. And let me also add that in some ways, I think the assumption was that they will go in and occupy few peaks, just some area. But then your typical operation, mission creep took place. It's when you go in and you see open spaces, and it's happened throughout military history. You'll see in so many wars. Mission creep takes place, and basically that's what happens. So instead of a few peaks, there are 186 or whatever. And I mean, peaks doesn't mean that, and setting up posts doesn't mean that there is brick and mortar. There are people hiding behind boulders, etc. Really, the story of Kargil, the heroes are young officers, soldiers who went and fought. I mean, it in some ways, the more you think about going at 18,000, 17,000 feet, going and battling and not even being owned up subsequently, you're being portrayed as the mujahideen, that you're not from the Pakistan army, etc. And the way these young soldiers went and fought, and so many embraced martyrdom as well. But I think that they're the real heroes, and it tells you time and again the conviction, the bravery, the courage, the passion of the soldiers in the Pakistan Army. This was a group that, a clique that planned, a clique or, again, this is a polite term, clique. I think it was they committed a blunder and facts speak for themselves, but what happened subsequently to them, we all know.
So I think, when I was reading the book, one thing that strikes in the prelude to, May, is that there was a lot of confusion about what the actual aim, the eventual strategic aim of the operation was. As you rightly say, that initially it was about 20 posts that they had, wanted to occupy. When they saw that all the Dras Kargil sector area was open, they set up some posts and they occupied another, approximately 140 or thereabouts. And repeatedly, when this issue started becoming bad and the Indians started responding, a lot of people asked the generals what their core intention was. Were they going to go all the way to Srinagar? Were they going to cut off the NH1? And do you think that there was confusion also within those who planned this operation about actually what the strategic aim, not the tactical, but the strategic aim of the operation was, number one? And number two, what role do you think the failure of the Siachen talks played in precipitating the generals to take action on Kargil? Because just before that, an agreement was almost finalized on Siachen. And from what we hear from various sources, it was the Indian Army which put its foot down on not withdrawing from Siachen and insisting on first demarcation on existing boundaries. So what role do you think the failure of the Siachen conversation had? And do you think there was confusion within the rank also, within those who were planning the operation?
I think that the talks in Siachen took place in October, November, somewhere there. So the talks, I think you're referring to an earlier period, Hassan, when there was a near agreement. At that point, there wasn't an agreement.
That was 80s.
Gigi, that was 80s. So that was an earlier period. At that point, there were just talks, and the talks didn't go anywhere, and they came back, basically. We have Shamshad Saab's intervention, which is very valuable, because Shamshad Ahmad Saab was then the foreign secretary. So he knows the story, and so he's sharing that with us. Thank you, sir. So, so anyway, so that was kind of routine. The Pakistani delegation went, there was Zamir Akram and people from the army, etc. And the Indians did the usual, and they came back, and it didn't go anywhere. But, after this book has come into print, there have been, and I'm very fortunate and very grateful that there have been many people in the army who were then serving at important positions who've come forward to share more information, which inshallah, when I revise it in July, all that information will come in. So it seems that even before General Musharraf took over, even before that, there was some plans to conduct an operation of this kind, and I think that there's no doubt that the operation snowballed into something much bigger. But what is important is, and therefore when you say there was confusion at the strategic level, I don't know what strategic thinking even went into it, because there were no questions, no serious questions asked. If you read military theory, if you read military history, this operation fails at every test. The planning test, the strategy test, the implementation, every test it fails. So, but well-meaning men deciding that India has to be given a bloody nose, we need to punish India, and I guess that's all I can say, because beyond that there is nothing that can justify an undertaking like this. And people who were there, and I mean the names are there because a lot of people spoke on record also. There were people in the army then. I think General Ashfaq Kyani was then heading the Murray Brigade at that point, and when he was asked to send his troops, he said no. And so there was criticism within the army as well. And in March, and let me also just for the audience say this, that what typically happens is that during winter months, both the armies bring down their troops. Hence, you may be wondering, how come there was nobody there? So this is a typical thing that happens every year. And so that year, when the Indians brought their troops down, the Pakistanis had planned to go in and occupy some of the peaks. So I think that there wasn't any clear thinking. I think they thought only up to the point, and Pakistani soldiers are brave. Indians have written about it, and people continue to write about it. Look at the way the Pakistan army, is FATA, look at counter-terrorism, look at the number who give up their lives for this country, for our security. So typically Pakistani soldiers are brave and committed, and even then I was talking to people, the cadet in cohort, they were saying that then during, I think it was when things really started to get complicated, when India started to react in June, early June, and they had asked for volunteers, and they wanted 10 and 1,000 would volunteer. So I think you had all of that going on, and so you had mission creep, and the kind of communication that was going on between the FCNA headquarters and the soldiers who were there, at 18,000 feet, 17,000 feet, fighting this battle, and
without logistics support.
Without logistics, no logistics supports were basically completely cut off, because the Indians then used Bofor guns very unconventionally, and they really pounded and pounded and pounded, between basically blowing up mountain tops and whatever, boulders and stones, and some in case of our soldiers as well.
So the big elephant in the room, which everybody talks about Kargil, is whether the political leadership was aware of the operation, gave the go-ahead for the operation. I think you very accurately put the date of the first briefing where Kargil operation was discussed to 17th May. And it's also interesting that the full corps commanders and the rest of the military was also briefed just a day before that. So on 17th May, and you narrate the whole meeting that took place, two former military generals who were in a political position, bureaucratic/political, Iftikhar Ali Khan and General Majid Malik, realized when the briefing was going on that this was a cross-LOC operation and that it would have repercussions. And when they started asking those questions, it seems in that meeting, even the political leadership did not really grasp the significance of what had happened, and it dawned on them only slowly and gradually as the operation progressed. So, what do you think the reaction of the Prime Minister was? And do you think that this idea of Fateh Kashmir played into the mind of the Prime Minister, who, instead of taking a very aggressive position on asking the boys to bring back the soldiers from the positions that they had occupied, instead thought that perhaps this would work and that he should go along with it?
Yeah, I think that the Prime Minister, there was no hard thinking, there. General Aziz was the one who said to him that, you will go down in history after Qaid-e-Azam, you will be the second most important man, and you will be remembered as Fateh Kashmir. And I think the maps, etc., that were shown, other than General Iftikhar, who doesn't mention anything there in the room. I think there's a side conversation in which he talks about what's happened, and it's after they leave the room that he raises it with the Prime Minister that, they've crossed the LOC. The account of that meeting is based on about 15, 20 interviews I did of people who were there. And I'm grateful to people like the former Foreign Secretary, him and others, many others who were there, who shared this and, who trusted and, trusted me and recalled all the details. So there's been checking, crossing. So Sartaj Aziz Sahib, who was then the Foreign Minister, did say at that point in that room that, what are we doing, Prime Minister? This is, we're already in the Lahore summit. Now, mind you, this is May, so Lahore summit, which was very, very systematically put together, institutions were involved and so on and so forth. I'll come back to that. on the distrust factor also between civil military. So at that meeting on May 17th, Mr. Tajazi Sahab said, but we are in a dialogue with the Indians, and the Americans will also say, what the hell are you doing, something to that effect. And the Prime Minister said, number one, he said कि Sir Taj साहब ये मीटिंग से किधर कश्मीर मिलने लगा हमें, and then वो दुआ शुआ जो भी पड़ी. So I think the Prime Minister thought, and I think you can fault the former Prime Minister for being what can I say? He doesn't comprehend enough. He didn't have a sharp mind. Didn't comprehend. Somebody, I heard the word dumb from here. Yeah, dumb or not dumb, but he didn't comprehend. I mean, people from the Pakistan Army who was sitting there were saying that, you know, the way the map was shown and the way the movements were shown, no civilian could have understood that they'd actually crossed the LOC. General Majid Malik said, you know, I've served there, what are you doing, what's going to happen next, etc., etc. But ultimately, I think that when you get to May 17th, until then, you cannot at all fault the elected leadership at all. And I've, you know, researched and and talked to so many people within the army and outside, other than those who with whom it's a matter of belief, not a matter of fact. They will say that the former Prime Minister was briefed, but the fact is that he was not briefed. In fact, if there is one very clear-cut evidence, if you read Sir Taj Sahab's own book, where he recalls this conversation he's reproduced, and you know, General Musharraf is having this conversation sitting in China with his Chief of General Staff on an open line and saying, अच्छा तो क्या हुआ, फिर उनको पता चला, पता नहीं टूटी बंद कर दी, खोल दी, और he says in that conversation very clearly that, so I hope the Prime Minister doesn't know. So there's enough evidence to prove that the Prime Minister didn't know. You know, what happened subsequently and how could he have handled it? Could he have handled it differently? By June 12th, I think, no, in fact, once the planes were shot May 26th, the Prime Minister and people, you know, in the Foreign Office, the political lot, tried to see what they could make out of the situation, but, you know, weak political leadership, asymmetrical, you know, power scene there, the military. It isn't until, you know, mid-June that the army and the army high command begins to concede that, you know, something needs to be done. Up until then, there is just a lot of bravado, and there's this feeling that obviously, you know, we are the winners, and all this this concern doesn't make sense at all. But subsequently, I think mid-June onwards.
So I think another interesting aspect of this is, if you look at two issues here which we'd like more to discuss. One is the civil-military distrust, which continues to exist till this day in some way or the other, and played an important role perhaps in the years to come after Musharraf in the last two democratic governments. So do you think the civil-military distrust existed between the elected leadership and the military at the same level before as it has after Kargil?
Yeah.
Or do you think it precipitated?
I think after, don't forget that, yeah, I think that the institution, the army as an institution, how much trust and faith, etc., it has in the elected leadership, that's an abiding problem, and that continues. If you start looking at individuals, General Musharraf was handpicked by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif at that point. But the interesting thing is that during my research, subsequently I met General Musharraf during Kargil and also afterwards. You know, he kept insisting, for example, that the Lahore Declaration had no mention of Kashmir. And I said it had, you know, Kashmir was mentioned thrice. He said, no, it wasn't mentioned at all. So there's this kind of belief that the civilians can't get it right. And even when the summit was taking place, the Lahore summit, I think there was reservation that this is not the route. This is not the route to take to the, as far as resolution of Kashmir is concerned. I think there is that big question has always been there, which is the best way forward if you want to deal with India. But it's the army chief right now, as we speak, who took the initiative, and the fact is that the Prime Minister has been talking about wanting to improve relations with India, etc. That is there, but the Kartarpur opening, who's taken the initiative, who's stated it, who's taking it forward, and so on and so forth. So I think that there is a real issue, irrespective of who's in power, the issue of distrust. And the distrust that the army as an institution has towards the civilians, in terms of, how are they going to handle India, etc. And will our interest be, if Pakistan's interest is going to be lost in the process. But I think it's more a perception, less a reality in terms of, people, the army is an institution. And again, let me quickly add that when Hena Rabbani Kar, for example, when the People's Party government came into power, there was much better coordination. Maybe we can ask the question, why the distrust? I think the distrust also takes place, that, there's a history and so on, we know about that. But how much of coordination exists? How much does the elected leadership make use of the institutions that are in place? How often are stakeholder meetings held? So when Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif came into power the last time, there was 17 months that you didn't have a meeting of the Committee on National Security, and they had set up this Committee on National Security with such fanfare. And then there was supposed to be a National Security Division that was put in place, and you had Ambassador Mohammad Sadiq. And there we were thinking that here's going to be a National Security Council of the Secretariat of the kind that you see in all other countries, where countries are serious about policy. But that didn't take place. And last time when Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was in power, I used to talk to people very close to him, They would, when, they'd say, "Ji, meeting kare." So then the Prime Minister, at one point, he said to one of his close confidants, bureaucrat, "Ke tusi elect ho ke aaye ho ya main?" So what I'm saying is that there are issues on, many fronts. But the question is obviously, what's the answer? And the answer really is using the institutions that are in place, using them effectively, so that that the military command
does not feel left.
Also contributes at the level it's supposed to contribute. But anyway.
So the other question is interesting when you talk about America and India and the relationship that the group of American diplomats, Strobe Talbot, Inderfath, Bruce Riedel was, I think, as a CIA then, or maybe had joined the NSA. Had joined the NSA.
Former
then,
CIA.
So the group of American diplomats, they had made quite an effort in '98 to stop Pakistan, give us incentives, etc., not to do the test. And this happens almost a year after that. They were Indophiles in some way. They were, do we see that during that period in '99 was the first emergence of America and India's to become strategic relationship, where we see a lot more coordination between Delhi and Washington on, what to say, what policy to adopt with the Pakistanis. The Indians were constantly being briefed about what conversation General Zini had in Islamabad, etc. So do you see that as the beginnings of a relationship that now we see as a strategic partnership between Delhi and Washington?
I think that was a very key period, and that certainly Kargil in a huge way contributed to to Washington and Delhi getting closer and closer. And as you say rightly, that on July 4th, as President Clinton was having his conversation with Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, when he stepped out, President Clinton called Prime Minister Vajpayee to brief him on everything. But mind you that India was then obviously a party to this whole thing. But obviously there were no takers in Delhi of Pakistan's point of view that, Pakistan, because of its nuclear test, and Pakistan, because of its nuclear position, was going to gain something, having crossed the LOC, and with this thinking that there's as a nuclear power, now we can blackmail. I mean, the word blackmail wasn't used, but the assumption, if you talk to the people in the army, this is what the assumption was. But if we were to leave aside the US for a moment, China was very clear. When Sartaji Sahab went to India on the 12th of June in an desperate effort to tell the Indians, let's talk, and they were saying, get the hell out unless you don't leave, there's no talk. The day before that, Sartaji Sahab had gone to China, and I remember he took some of us to Delhi with him, about 24 journalists, and I remember saying, and I thought his Kargil was unfolding. I also thought that it's the Mujahideen, it's towards the end, the one discovered, it's our own soldiers. So I remember saying to Sartaj Sahab in the plane, I said, "Bada acha kiya Indians ke saath." He said, "What? Acha kiya? You don't know what the Chinese said to me, and the Chinese said, get out of there, and what are you doing, and you're going to create chaos." So it was such a blunderous thing to have done, that nobody was standing by our side. Everybody was saying, end it immediately. But my own view on, as far as the US is concerned, is that the US lied, and these individuals who you just named, Inderfat, etc., misstated facts and said that Pakistan was moving its nuclear weapons, which was, and Shamshad Sahab, all that Shamshad Sahab had said as Foreign Secretary was that that if we are attacked, we will defend ourselves using whatever means possible. And they turned that around and they started to say Pakistan is moving nuclear weapons, and to get Clinton involved in it, President Clinton, they had to basically make the plea that that the Pakistanis are going to go and use nuclear weapons, etc., and so that the July 4th meeting takes place. So yes, of course, Pakistan contributed at that point through its Kargil blunder in getting the Americans and
the Indians closer.
I mean, they would have gotten closer. This was a relationship in the making. But that was another element that contributed.
So, on the book, the lessons from Kargil, both diplomatically and militarily, do you think that right now we are seeing a resurgence of the Kashmir movement inside the valley, especially in South Kashmir? But, from all accounts that one hears, the plug has been tightened a little bit in terms of, the army has made an effort not to provide material support, and Pakistan is working on providing diplomatic support. Today, Kashmir is far more in the news, is far greater an international issue than it was in 1999. But do you see there has been a strategic change or a learning from Kargil in how Pakistan is handling the current situation, or do you once again put this in the entire context of where Pakistan is regionally, and that is also dictating our response to what's happening inside Kashmir?
I think Kashmiris have to be saluted for their struggle, and it's the Kashmiris who are doing it. It's Burhanuddin Wani whose martyrdom has got the movement again in a very significantly high resistance mode, and the Indian response, and then Modi's contributed to the via the atrocities of the Indian state. I think that Pakistan's learning from Kargil, I'm not so sure if there's
any learning.
I'm not so sure. I think that ultimately, Hassan, it has to be an understanding of the basic fact that, number one, institutions are critical. Institutionalized approaches are important, and factors like distrust and factors like blunders. The more you think about it, we can sit here and we can start taking names of individuals A, B, C, D, and we can say the army is terrible and army's committed blunders. Of course, it's committed blunders. Of course, I can start talking about 20 of those and mistakes, and it has. The militarization of foreign policy, all of that has been there. But what is the answer? The answer seems to me that has to be what when Prime Minister, what the People's Party government was trying to do. I'm not talking about President Zardari and his riches and his fake accounts. I'm now talking very specifically on foreign policy, national security. There was an institutionalized approach to decision making. All the stakeholders under the elected leadership were meeting regularly. So, for example, the India-Pakistan trade agreement was in the works, but for what the message that we got from Delhi to stop it then for political reasons. So it seems to me that you have to take the route of institutions, and that's the only way. That is the only way that you can then ensure that your policy making is coherent and it's all encompassing in terms of understanding the context, the regional context, the international context, and then stakeholders have to be part of it. Otherwise, policy gets sacrificed at the altar of gossip, conspiracy, distrust, etc. And it seems to me that that's what we've been witnessing by and large.
So another watershed moment in India-Pakistan history, if you talk to Indian interlocutors, and we do that on our track tour as well, is that they often tell us that Mumbai has been a transformative event in how in at least South Bloc thinks about Pakistan and about talking to Pakistan. After Kargil, we saw the 2004 effort, etc. The 4-point formula came out from Musharraf. The Indians engaged with the same person responsible for Kargil. Do you think that in today's environment, that India and Pakistan can proceed in that direction? Or do you see that the frost, this current frost between Delhi and Islamabad is the new normal, and that for a long time now and in the years to come, that it will be far more difficult for India and Pakistan to engage in a comprehensive dialogue? Do you see that change after Mumbai, or do you think it's still possible?
Well, thanks for referring to General Musharraf and his 4 points. The fact is that exactly the things for which General Musharraf was blaming the former Prime Minister, and he was supposed to be a Ghaddar and he was A, B, C, D, exactly the same things General Musharraf, the same policy steps General Musharraf took vis-a-vis India. He went to India, and at that point Pakistan walked on its knees to go to Agra. And at the Lahore summit, the way it was planned, the way it all took place, Pakistan stood there tall and India came to Pakistan. And I think that is one of the biggest blunders, that led to aborting of the Lahore process. So it's also interesting always, that the army, and I hate to use the army kind of as an institution because there have been wise generals as well, but I think we're talking of generals who are ambitious, or those who take control of the country, the coup makers, etc. Their own the initiatives they take with India, those seem to be very kosher. And it's when civilians take initiatives, but again, as I said to you, I guess that too is in black and white, because in the case of Yusuf Raza Gilani's time, the initiatives with India, trade was a major initiative, and that was seen as not, not a move made by traitors. But when you have Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, former Prime Minister, calling Mittal, who's the steel magnate? Jindal coming, and he's taken to Murray as if you're hiding something from others and you're not open about it. I think that leads to problems. Hence institutionalized, transparent, etc. But coming back to your question, I think that the problem on Pakistan-India today, by and large, lies in Delhi, and specifically in Delhi's politics. So post the elections, I think, which are in August or September this year, the Indian elections, I think after the elections we may see improved relations. I think that even if Modi comes back, hopefully you will see some kind of thaw in the relationship. In fact, even before that, I am told now that in Kartarpur, initiative. After that, I think it's in May or something is the
Opening.
yeah, the opening that is going to take place. So Pakistan and India are now going to engage quite actively on working on that. So it's blow hot, blow cold, but I don't see any major breakthroughs. Any major breakthroughs.
So thank you. Since we're almost at 5, we'd like to open up the session for questions and answers. We'll start with Ijaz and then Sir at the back.
Thank you. Since one can assail this entire thing from multiple angles, I'll try and be parsimonious about it. I think it's easy to unpack this because if you take an institutional approach, and I'm not going to mince any words on this, having written about this also, it's very simple. If you are doing something surreptitiously without involving the chief executive or the civilian principals, then that is a clear case for a field journal court-martial. As a matter of fact, so all these 4 journals are fit cases for FGCMs. As a matter of fact, additionally, General Aziz and General Musharraf are doubly qualified for this when they discussed an ongoing operation on an open line without using any scramblers. So it's very easy to unpack. Now, as far as this idea of the civil-military relations is concerned, and I think one of the simplest ways of looking at it in terms of why civilian principals should have effective control of the military, and this is regardless of the capabilities on the civilian side. The simple principle is, and the organization theory is very clear about this, that large-scale bureaucratic organizations are afflicted with bounded rationality and systematic stupidity. And it's not because the people there are stupid. It's about past dependence. It's about the fact that you have institutional memory. And it's about increasingly, in this particular case, where you have war coast generals who look at the world in operational terms, in military operational terms, not in strategic terms. So it's very simple that if you are going to do this, and this is why, late Major General Shaukat Reza, when he wrote his book on the 65 war operations, I remember reading it in my teens, and I was struck by one of the sentences where he said, somehow we convinced, as in Pakistan convinced ourselves, that our strategic objectives are holier than India's. Having said that, I have to say that the Pakistan Air Force and the Pakistan Navy had a much better measure of the situation. We have, luckily, Air Commodore Kaisar Tufal sitting here, who wrote this brilliant piece on what was going on and how the Air Force was involved and how the Air Force realized what these guys were planning to do.
So the point?
So the point is that it's not just it's the army when it begins to think in a certain way without any monitoring mechanism as far as the civilian principles are concerned.
Precisely. Okay, so here's the point. I mean, I think that we all agree, there is no doubt about it, and time and again we go through these blunders, and so it's unaccountable authority that the military has. So I think the million-dollar question now has to be, how do you make that happen? I think that's what all researchers and strategists should focus on. How do you make that happen? Because there is the reality of who's holding the gun. There's the reality of who, where the power lies in terms of security, etc. We also know that just saying is not enough. So in November 1998, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, then Prime Minister, holds this meeting of the Defense Cabinet Committee, and he decides 3 things. Number 1, that we are going to change our policy towards the Taliban. Number 2, on Kashmir, we're not going to go in with military support. We will, increase the diplomatic, etc. And something on Osama. And a general who was sitting in that meeting then, I remember, telling me, "Ke abhi, you know, he's decided, but he's decided. It doesn't matter." And it's true. So what I'm saying is that, you know, our positions notwithstanding, the constitution which is sacred notwithstanding, how do you change this around is the question. But may I, with your permission, ask the Foreign Secretary, former Foreign Secretary, if he wants to say something, because he said he's here just briefly. So Shamshad Sahab, if you want to add something.
Couple of points that about the impact of the Kargil episode on Siachen. Well, as I did point out that the agreement, the so-called agreement that was reached between the two countries was in the 80s, 87 in fact. So Kargil did not have anything to do with Siachen, or Siachen had anything to do with Kargil. Likewise, your other question on India's attitudinal change that still remains as intransigent as it could be, that also had nothing to do with Kargil. And that doesn't mean that I'm exonerating the Kargil tragedy. Of course, I agree with Nasim that it was a debacle. Although the objectives of Kargil were, to quote Ejaz, were highly noble. They were noble, but noble ends never justify ignoble means.
Yeah.
So I'm not going into the failures of Kargil, but I'm going into the aftermath, the impact of Kargil or the other developments, ensuing developments on the prospects of India-Pakistan peace. And that's what I'm more interested in India-Pakistan peace, because perhaps if I may here be boastful, sorry if I use this word, well, perhaps the only peace process in India-Pakistan history was the one that I negotiated with my Indian counterpart in 97. And neither in the earlier 50 years nor in the later 20 or 30 years, any such effort has succeeded. But why India is now holding on its intransigent position is not Kargil, not Pakistan's any measures that Pakistan had taken. It's purely the 9/11. The global anti-terror sentiment that gave India an idea that this is the time to put Pakistan in the dock. And that is when they made up their mind. So Kargil did derail the dialogue process between India and Pakistan, but it was supposed to come back once the 4th of July meeting had taken place. We were returning to that. But once 9/11 took place, the Indians thought that this is the time. So it was a calculated, cold-blooded, realpolitik on the part of the Indians, and that's how the Twin Peaks events, incidents, the tensions on the line of control on international border, the deployment of India's armed forces on our borders, and then of course the worries, global worries on the danger of global nuclear conflict. So that led to the intervention of the Western countries in that ceasefire, Musharraf's ceasefire, and the January 2004 India-Pakistan agreement, Islamabad agreement, which in fact that agreement was drafted by the Americans. Because when I happened to be in America at that time, when I saw that agreement of January 2004, I said it is not the Indian language drafting, it is not the Pakistan, because I'm familiar with both.
Foreign Office had nothing to do with it.
Purely the American language that was used in that statement. And when I came back, Riaz Khokar confirmed to me. He said, yes, Rana Khan.
They didn't have it.
Actually, he said, Tariq Aziz gave me a piece of paper in Marriott Hotel that Foreign Secretary, Saab, ek kagaz sign kar lage. So the dynamics had changed after 9/11. And those dynamics were further aggravated by the Mumbai 2008 And 2008, mind you one, that in October 2008, President Obama, as a presidential candidate, just 1 month before his election, he had made a public commitment on program, CBS program, 60 Minutes, that if I'm elected,
Kashmir.
I will work for India-Pakistan peace. And I'll try to have this issue of Kashmir, because that is the main hurdle, because otherwise we will not be able to have Pakistan support on Afghanistan. So within 1 month, within 1 year after his election, well, November 2008, this Mumbai takes place. Now, who was the beneficiary? That's I leave it to all of you, because Pakistan did not gain from Bombay, and it was India. The Kashmiris lost, Pakistan lost, and Pakistan continues to lose. So one has to think on a broader canvas.
yes.
I'm not initiating any discussion, but I just want to make my
Comments,
mind.
Jay.
So this is about the current Indian attitude. And you asked also about whether India will return. Well, now I think again there is a sea change in the region and globally also, with Trump, Imran Khan chemistry now suddenly producing some positive climate.
Very
And, one
temporary.
doesn't know.
Sir,
No,
it's very temporary,
unpredictable. Very
please.
unpredictable. Absolutely, I
Very
agree. But still, one has to keep fingers crossed. And if things move in the right direction on Afghanistan, and elections also in India, they are
India.
crucial. Imran Khan will, I think, enter into any a good arrangement, positive breakthrough with any leader in New Delhi other than Modi. Modi, as long as Modi is there, there is no prospect of India.
Thank you, sir. Sir,
Jay.
the gentleman at the back.
Hello, Dr. Tariq Rahman, that's my
Yes,
name.
of course.
I would actually like to thank you very much. I have reviewed your book,
Of course,
and
sir.
as I wrote in my review, and it's an excellent book, but with very good research in it. But that is not why I'm thanking you. I'm thanking you because you had the courage to say that you had changed your mind after your research. Most people don't do that. They, first of all, they don't change their mind, and secondly, they don't say so. And so that is what I'd like to praise you for. Actually, some of these things, I wonder if you recall what you have said today. Those are the kind of things I said in those days, but you disagreed. So I thank you all the more that you changed your mind and said so. That's it. Thank you.
The question at the back.
My name is Jazib and I'm a senior student here studying economics. So you have talked more about, analyzes more about from a individuals, focusing more on individuals. It might be more important to do that. But I would want you to talk a bit about, from an institutional point of view, that what incentive did the army have as an institution to do all this over ambitious thing, given that the kind of institutional imbalance we have, and given that, as many people argue, you could agree or disagree with that army in Pakistan, as also in many other developing countries or less developed countries, have interests that do not align with other stakeholders of the state.
Thank you.
So if you could talk.
Yeah, we'll take 3 questions, so and then we can go to answers. So, gentleman at the back, I think you have the mic. Yeah, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My question is relating to how far journalists can question actions being taken behind the scenes. So when we see Vietnam and how in the 60s and 70s it was journalists who brought forward American failure, my question for the Honorable Lady is, in your research over the past few years, have you seen similar voices in Pakistan, our community and our journalist society, which try to question these decisions? And if you could mention what these voices usually say and how they approach, especially Kargil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Saleha?
Yes, first of all, thank you for sharing your thoughts. My name is Saliha Kamal, I'm a faculty member here. So my question takes us back to the strategic partnership between the United States and India that we talked about. So with the upcoming elections in the US, we're kind of seeing a lot of candidates with close ties to India kind of emerge on the stage. So you have Kamala Harris, you have Tulsi Gabbard, obviously Bobby Jindal is still in the scene, right? So with this current landscape, what are your suggestions for Pakistan's foreign policy?
Okay.
The first one was about Army's institutional.
Yeah, I think, it was, the book covered individuals in the case of Kargil because the army as an institution did not support the effort. It was 4 generals, and hence I refer to them as the Kargil clique. And as Hassan was saying, it wasn't until 15th, 16th of May, which is 2 days before the elected Prime Minister and his team got to know about, what was happening. Before that, so 2 days before that, the rest of the army top command got to know about it. So actually individuals led this effort. There were 4 individuals who led the effort, 4 generals. And hence we had to talk about individuals and not the institution. But I guess you can ask the question rightly that those 4 individuals came from that institution and hence they reflected partly the institutional thinking. I think that in the Pakistan Army, it seems to me, doing my research and having worked on these issues for a while, that there are 2 kinds of outlooks. One is where, the feeling is that military view and the military approach and a militarized approach towards India, use of force is what will finally get India to listen to us. And not to listen to us as much as, India will do the right thing by Pakistan if we use force, if there's subversion, etc., etc., covert operations, etc., which India also does as far as Pakistan is concerned. And then there is the other outlook, where there is recognition that force cannot be the primary tool for engaging India. And I think when you look at individuals of this kind, if you look at generals with this outlook, you'll see that these are the kind of generals who will then subscribe to a policy, well thought out civilian policy, where diplomacy, trade, and obviously, the military aspect has a role to play in terms of relationship with India. In terms of, what is, you also asked a question that what is the thinking and, why would the people in the army, why would this institution have this kind of bias? I think one thing we've got to be clear that, you take an organization, in an organization, any commercial organization, so you have the marketing department, you have the engineering department, you have the financial department, you have different departments. So similarly, when, in a country is run by people with different specializations. So you have the defense ministry, and under that defense, not under the defense ministry, supposed to be under that defense ministry, but you do have the army as one important institution, and armies are trained to think, there's a linearity in the military's thinking. Pakistani army thinks that it understands everything and that, they read Newsweek and they read Time magazine and so on and so forth. So their understanding and of world affairs is as good as anybody's. In some cases they may be right, but institutionally, the army and armies world over are trained to think in terms of, identifying the enemy and, working on responses, etc. So whenever the army will come into the driving seat in the country, in Pakistan, who took Pakistan to this Afghan war? Who took Pakistan into this proxy war? It was a general who was, who's in power, and so on and so forth. We can go into details, but I think that the Pakistan Army, very important institution, one that one has a lot of respect for, critical. It's sacrificed so much for this country, but its place is not in major national policy making. It has a very critical role in contributing, as far as contributing towards national security policy. And so the problem, and this is what I was saying to my friend Ijaz in the beginning, that I think we're left now struggling with this question, that ultimately the elected leadership has to be of a caliber where military's input comes in as an input in the relevant field, and not that you have a situation where the army is saying the civilians don't care, so let's make policy and give them the policy and tell them do A, B, C, D, and they'll do it. So, I think that's a long debate, but ultimately the question is that the army will think the way it thinks. What is the elected civilian leadership doing? How is it using institutions? How is it using its platform? How is it using the parliament? You have the parliamentary committees. There are multiple. You have oversight committees. I mean, the Committee on Defense, Committee on Foreign Policy, they actually have suo motu powers. They can call in. Technically. This is what I'm saying. But who's going to turn that technicality into a reality? That's really the million-dollar question.
That's true. I think also, there's a lot of work to be done on national security literacy of, on the civilian side also. Bringing on experts on board that understand. Obviously, not every prime minister is supposed to have national security literacy, but he can bring civilian experts certainly with him who understand the dynamics, which is sometimes not the case. The second question, Nasim, was about journalism's role in bringing.
Well, I think that there are, in Pakistan, there have been many journalists who've, Kargil, I'll tell you, during Kargil, there was Aziz Siddiqui Saab, he's died now, marhum. There was Ayaz Amir. These were people who were, during Kargil, when Kargil was happening, they were saying, what the hell is this? This is wrong, it's our soldiers, etc. So in Pakistan, there is a rich tradition of journalists, raising questions, and sometimes, you'll hear people say from different institutions that journalists ask too many questions. But in Pakistan, there is a tradition, and where, you look at the US, in the case of Iraq, the entire journalistic community went along with Colin Powell's lies, etc., and now they're writing so many books. But in the case of Kargil, I can tell you, people were, in fact, in 71 also, people like Anis Mirza, etc., were writing even then the issues and the problems that existed, how MQM was dealt with in the case of Balochistan. So Pakistan has a rich tradition of journalists raising questions. We have all types of journalists.
So the question on suggestions, I think that was related to the growing influence of Indian Americans or Americans of Indian origin that are now coming on in Congress and in their research committees, etc.
You counter influence by influence, and what makes influence? What are you at home? What is your what's your own level of development? What's your trade power? What's your soft power? There are all those things. So the stronger you are at home, it's going to reflect that. And this is something that we've been dealing with for a long time. So you just have to improve things, yeah.
So last set of questions. We'll take three.
Assalamu alaikum, miss. I am Muaz Aslam. I am a law major here at LUMS. My question is that you rightly mentioned the amplification and the fresh impetus provided to the Kashmir movement post the death of Burhan Wani. But what I want you to do is shed some light on the impact of the Kargil on the Kashmir issue, because there is a growing perception, rather apprehension among the international community that post-Kargil, that whether the Kashmir movement is genuine or whether these so-called mujahideen are actually disguised Pakistani army men. And the fact that Pakistan has failed to effectively put forward its narrative in regards to Jaish-e-Mohammed and Dr. Hafiz Saeed domestically has raised some concern. So the question as it is the Kashmir movement genuine movement or a Pakistani instigated one?
Thank you. So short questions, please, because we're running out of time, Ji.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Shahabuddin Ahmed. I teach here at LUMS. You mentioned institutions, and you mentioned a clique within an institution that made a particular decision in Kargil. So my question is speculative, but I think it's a speculation that Kargil sort of serves to sort of explain somewhat. I'm wondering if this idea that sort of, the civil-military debate is fairly well sort of debated, it's nuanced. Within the military, is this a sort of regular occurrence, the idea that sometimes within this particular institutions that is fairly big in every particular way, the power is sort of de facto and de jure in very sort of different sort of contexts. The idea that the left hand doesn't know what the right one is doing, right? So, I mean, I'm thinking in terms of Kargil being carried out by a clique without being sort of discussed and a broader consensus being gained even within the security apparatus. So, I mean, there are examples that come to mind, things like Operation Jalalabad or Bin Laden, etc. I'm just wondering if this is something that goes beyond Kargil, what you would sort of think about that.
Thank you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Right, perfect. I don't need the mic, it's good. My name is Najib Sheikh. I'm actually a senior studying economics and politics. My question, actually, it's a very small question, of course. I actually enjoyed your talk very much. I think the Fletcher School would also be very proud of you. But I also think that you mentioned and repeated the word blunder, right? And regarding what the Army's role was and what the Army did, X, Y, Z. And even the questions that you answered, they were very, very well, diplomatic in answers, right? And I'd just like to kind of note that every answer that you've given in terms of about the Army kind of highlighted that the Army will think the way they think. What is the elected official or what is the civilian going to do about it? But considering our history, right, no matter how short or long you think it is, do you really think that the civilian, a layman just like me, a budding scholar just like me, has the power to actually question an institution such as the Army, which has time and time again done what it needs to do? It's the 10-year itch that we call it, right?
Okay, I think we get the gist of that
No,
question.
yeah, I think it's a very important question. Thank you for asking the question. And yes, we live in very difficult times. I'm not trying to be diplomat. I'm anything but diplomatic. And the professor was picked up a mark 2 days ago. In my program, I talked about it in detail. And, it is our responsibility to keep raising these issues. I think that human rights, while the state and its significance, the institution, the Army as an institution, intelligence agencies as institutions, and their importance and significance and their respect, etc., is something that I do believe in. I equally believe in the sanctity of the citizens' fundamental rights, and we must keep talking about it. I think that what you state and your, it's kind of bordering on frustration is correct. And I understand and I empathize with it, but I don't have any quick answers, and there are no instant solutions. These are processes, and we have to continue to talk about these. And those of us who are such located where we can amplify concerns like yours, we have to continue to do it. And political class has a role to play. Dr. Shireen Mazari is a friend of mine. I can say that on, for example, enforced disappearances, she is now very clear and she's very consistent on her position. She's also making some moves in terms of introducing laws where enforced disappearances, etc., will be treated as crimes. And so also censorship, and where just before this discussion started, I was talking to our friends here, that the other day there was some discussion on television, and some of us just used the word army, and there was a beep that was applied by the channel, not that GHQ was applying the beep. So I think that this is a process where there are concerns and counter concerns, and we have to, remaining responsible and remaining within our constitutional rights, we have to continue to raise these issues. And I think that this 10-year itch I think perhaps will have to disappear, because we are also living in a context where this itch may not be so easy to implement. On the other hand, some people will say that the civilians listen to the army so much that the army doesn't need to come and actually launch a coup d'etat. But at the same time, I think we are 15 years into. This is the third or fourth? Third round of uninterrupted democratic rule, and we've got to see it for what it is. And those who believe in democracy and people's rights will have to work harder, and the government will have to work harder. These are processes. There are no instant answers. I mean, the army, sections of the army can create problem. Their view of security has been very different. Their view of security since Ziaul Haq's time, late General Ziaul Haq's time, has been very different. And with time, we've seen that the army has had to change its own view. After all, it's an army which, I mean, that's another debate, but army has had to fight terrorism now. The role of the army in counter-terrorism has been important, and some forces that the army at one point thought were promoting Pakistan's interests, those very forces they've had to push back on themselves. So I think we are hopefully, it's a different period. It will take time, but it will take continuous effort by everybody. I hope this wasn't just diplomacy.
So the question on whether the lack of internal consensus on decision making within the security services still continues as a problem, I think that was the question.
Or has it been the case in other instances other than Kargil also?
Well, I think that the question you asked is a question that I kept asking people in the army, that what are the because one major concern would be that if the army is as disciplined and as organized and all of this, which it is, and it has, there are counters to, there is many levels of checks and balances supposedly within the army. I would like General Nadeem to say a few words on it. We'll come back to him. General Nadeem is former MI head, and so we'll ask him to shed some light on this. I think that this is a question I didn't get an answer to, but I was told that yes, after Kargil we've thought this through and something like this will not happen. General Nadeem, would you like to say a bit on this, please?
I didn't catch his question completely.
His question was that, would you want to repeat it?
All right. I was just wondering if this, given that the security apparatus in Pakistan is a massive security apparatus, be that numbers or other sort of things, is it possible that sort of sometimes parts of that particular apparatus are, not always working with a consensus? And maybe that Kargil sort of is one example that happened right at the top.
I gather is that your question is that whether the army in Kargil,
everybody wasn't on board, and so there was divergence. And so, how do you take care of
it's a very different topic. I won't get into it. Please try to understand. The army's decision making is corporate based. So there is a lot of talk when it's said that things are not known. Now it depends. But as far as I have served in the army, and I have been so, army's decision making is exactly like a corporate organization. So if some people say that they didn't know about it, it depends where they were, whether they had to know about it. So I'll leave it at that when some people say about it. You call it a clique, that's okay, that it is. There are always differences of opinion within the army's decision-making process, as it happens in any corporate body. But once a decision is taken, then the army goes for an implementation all along. You mentioned about a certain division commander who did not move his troops. I don't think that is correct.
It is correct.
Regarding that. So I don't think that is correct if somebody has said it. There was no disobedience.
No, I didn't say, no, I think, let's, you
but when
complete your
mentioned that
answer.
a certain division commander did
Yeah,
not
yeah.
move his troops. So I don't agree with it. So it never happened in that manner. Whether it can happen again, well, I can't say about it. But I will relate one thing also. You know why stupidity takes place? When you have stupid leadership. When you have stupid leadership.
In an institution.
Not in an institution, all along. All along, because there are students sitting here, they should try to understand this. When you say that why within an army certain stupid decisions are being taken, please try to understand, and we are all citizens of Pakistan, there is a certain capability which your political leadership should also have to judge facts. When you say a prime minister was sitting and was being shown maps which he did not try to understand,
it's his fault.
well,
After the troops had
But
been
that's
deployed.
May 17th now.
Had been
No, only at that point.
at that point.
Yeah.
I will leave it at that. I won't get into the semantics of it.
No, it's not semantics, it's substance.
But what I would like to say, when you have a prime minister along with his advisors, among whom two are very ex-senior generals
Yeah.
who know exactly what is being said,
Yeah.
who are sitting there, you have a foreign minister sitting over there who knows what is happening. By the way, when the atomic explosion took place, I was Pakistan's military advisor with our mission in UN. So
For that we can say well done, but
that
not
is-
for
So I would
Kargil.
say that there are certain things that you need, but it is very easy to palm it off by saying that we didn't understand. Or somebody says, it's very important to have capability and a certain caliber in your leadership to control your institutions. If that doesn't happen, you will not be able to control an institution. And as the debate has gone over here, that why is a certain institution going overboard, don't ask for its advice, do things the way you need to do it. Who stopped you? from that?
I think I think that on that issue, there's no debate that the elected leadership has to be more competent and, as Hassan said, get more advice and get more expertise in. But I think just to set the record straight in terms of the May 17th meeting, when Prime Minister was told about all this, that is 6 months into the operation having started. So yes, at that point the Prime Minister should have understood what was being said, but even if he would have understood, then the question was, what would he have done? I mean, that's obviously another question, because 7 months into the troops having crossed the LOC. In terms of your or my conveying in a way that you understood that I said, General Kiani said, I won't send the troops. No. I said, he was saying when the discussion took place, some people thought that it was not the best way to go forward. It's not, nobody can disobey orders. I don't think that was the question. But also in terms of, Ijaz, you said at one point that these 4 generals should have been court-martialed. The truth is, the reality is that after Kargil ended and this whole coup business was in the works, General Musharraf was given another post. He was given the chairman, Joint Chief of Staff Committee. Leave aside him being court-martialed. So,
To say that failure is an awful, in this case the failure is gets you. But here's the thing, I think apropos of what General Nadeem talked about as far as
Ijaz, we're
corporate
short on
things.
time. We can
Hold
discuss.
on. This is an important point.
brief,
Need to know basis. Should the MO Directorate be in the loop? The MO Directorate was brought into the loop
Nobody was-
with reference to this operation.
nobody was-
after the operation had been
in January.
Yes.
It's like Oliver North saying to, who was the president then, George Bush, when he was asked about the Contras, he said the president is told on a need basis. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do as far as the civilians are concerned.
Ji sir, bilkul.
Would you want to speculate on the trajectory of Indo-Pak relations after the Lahore Declaration had Kargil not taken place?
Sir, unwise to speculate, but I can tell you the facts that, that obviously discussions were taking place somewhere along these, the 4 points that General Musharraf then picked up subsequently, the Indian Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh and Pakistani Foreign Minister Sartaj Aziz were having meetings, and they were looking at various ways to move forward, but it would be foolhardy to come to any conclusions. What one can safely say is that they were on track to finding solutions, but it was going to be a process. It was going to take a long time, but what we certainly know is that Kargil was Kargil hijacked the whole process towards an end which was a blunder. Thank you.
And there was a question about the Kashmir.
Oh yes, on Kashmir, no. I think that for anybody to suggest that this is the Pakistan army going and fighting inside, for God's sakes, for now, now it is amply clear that it is a homegrown movement. Look at the youngsters who are getting up. Look at the endless number of Burhan Wanis who are there and giving up their lives to this struggle. And this struggle is not going to go anywhere. It's a tough one, but don't forget that the Kashmiris have been fighting the Dogra Raj onwards. It's 100 years plus. And so, one of their leading human rights activists, Khurram Parvez, is talking to. He's written this amazing, report also, 900 cases of human rights violations, and he's tracked that every case goes back to the Indian courts, the Indian administration, the Indian police. So how there's such a strong network in India which actually goes against the Kashmiris and trying to suppress the Kashmiris. I was asking him the other day, I said, he lives in Srinagar, his leg has been blown in one of the blasts. And I said, why, to what end all of this? He said, don't worry, this is, it goes into our collective consciousness, and the Kashmiris are never going to accept this Indian hegemony, Indian control and Indian oppression. Pakistan has messed up on and off on Kashmir. I think in 91, the Kashmiri uprising, the first uprising, I think we went and we... 89, we messed up. We messed up, but now it's really in the hands of the Kashmiris. We have an important role to play, diplomatic and politically, no doubt, and we should continue to play that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So on that, just some data for you as students. I mean, the Indian former Corps Commander General Atta Hassan, he's very open about the number of militants in Kashmir. It's between all Indian Corps Commanders. It's about 200 to 300 militants. And it's not a militant insurgency. It is a political insurgency more than it is a militant insurgency today. And there are vast areas and this is not something new. It's going on since 2003. I remember 2013, I was in Delhi. And that was the first time that we started hearing on a track 2. And there were some Kashmiri journalists there who had come from Srinagar. And they were telling us that, students, young students, MA, bachelors, PhDs, they said that our peaceful intifada of 2011 had failed, and that we need to take up arms against Indian oppression. And that has developed, they had study circles, etc., and that has developed. So it's entirely an homegrown effort today. And any effort by Indians to make it sound as if there's terrorism or Pakistanis are sending people across, I think is disingenuous on the part of the Indians. On civil military coordination, there was a lot of questions about that, and whether we can make the army listen. I think Nasim rightly pointed out, and this is an area of research for young students like yourselves, that if you compare the government of 2008 to 2013, where you had crises like Salala, you had Raymond Davis, you had Osama bin Laden, etc., and you compare that with the previous democratic government post-2013, you will see that despite issues like Memo Gate, etc., that there was, on national security issues, there was a lot more coordination. In fact, during a period, I think when Salala was happening, there was a weekly meeting every Monday.
Daily 16 hours, 14 hours.
In which all key decision makers, including the civilian government and from the ISI and the military, were part of that. I think really one of the real challenges has been to evolve a process where policy making takes place with all inputs considered. And I think that's something, even the Foreign Office feels like sometimes that their input is not being considered, when some democratic governments are run through kitchen cabinets or even smaller than kitchen cabinets. So I think, not to blame this on anybody, but I think that our own institutional decision-making process, large countries like even India is a large country, others have an evolved security apparatus. They have a National Security Council, they have decision-making bodies where decisions are taken. And I think Pakistan has been unable to evolve those mechanisms. So I think that's the way the future will go. Thank you, Nasim, once again for your talk.